The nurse asked me if there was anyone she could call. I looked at the door my mother had just walked out of, still swinging, and said, "No, there's no one." I was 32 years old, lying on a hospital gurney with a fractured wrist and two cracked ribs, and my mother had just told a nurse, "She has insurance. Call her a cab when she's done." Then she straightened her coat and left to make her dinner reservation. My name is Tiffany Turner. And what my mother did not know, what my brother Bryce did not know, was that the surgeon who had just walked through that door and picked up my chart had come to that hospital for one reason. Me. He looked at my name. Then he looked at me. And he asked a question that made the nurse beside him go completely still. "Why didn't anyone tell us it was you?" Before I continue, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever been left behind by the one person who was supposed to show up. I grew up in a house that looked like a Christmas card. Stone facade, black shutters, a circular driveway with a fountain that my mother had imported from a vineyard in Tuscany. From the outside, the Turner home in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked like the kind of place where people were happy, where children were loved equally, where a family sat down to dinner and asked each other about their days. Inside, it was something else entirely. My brother Bryce was 4 years older than me, and from the moment I was old enough to understand the difference, I understood this. Bryce was the point of the family, and I was the footnote. He was the one my father introduced first at parties, the one my mother drove 40 minutes each way to lacrosse practice for, 3 times a week without complaint, the one whose report cards were framed, actually framed, and hung in the hallway outside my father's study. I was the one who took the bus. It was not dramatic, the way I was set aside. That is the thing about this kind of family. There are no screaming matches, no locked doors, no bruises anyone can point to. It is quieter than that. It is your mother forgetting to pick you up from piano recital because Bryce had a scrimmage. It is your father saying, at Thanksgiving when you mention you got a scholarship, "Bryce got one too, you know, his was larger." It is learning, by age 9, that your accomplishments are always going to be measured against someone else's first, so I stopped announcing them. I was a decent student, then a good one. Then quietly, an excellent one. I studied finance at UConn, not Yale like Bryce, which my mother mentioned to me no fewer than 11 times during my freshman orientation weekend. I graduated near the top of my class, took a junior analyst position at a firm in Stamford, and began doing what I had always done in that house, working without making noise. I moved out at 22, into a one-bedroom apartment in Norwalk with a radiator that clanged every night at 2 in the morning and a parking lot view. I ate a lot of rice and rotisserie chicken that first year. I tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet I kept open on my laptop, from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep. My mother called it living small. I called it building a foundation. By 25, I had cleared my student loans and put $18,000 into a diversified index portfolio. By 27, I had moved into a cleaner apartment in Stamford and begun taking on private clients on the side, small business owners, a few physicians, a woman who had just inherited money from her late husband and had no idea what to do with it. I was good at the work. More than good. I had a way of reading a financial picture that other people missed. The thing underneath the thing, the risk hiding inside what looked like stability. I never talked about any of this at family dinners. Bryce, by then, was finishing his orthopedic surgery residency at Columbia and already moving like a man who expected doors to open for him. Because in our family, they always had. He drove a car that cost more than my annual salary at the time. He wore a watch he mentioned at every gathering. He married Candace, who had cheekbones like a sculpture and a laugh that only came out when she was making a point at someone else's expense. At Christmas, the year I turned 28, Candace asked me, in front of the whole table, what I was doing with my career. I told her I was in financial consulting. She tilted her head, the way a person does when they want to seem curious but are actually filing information away under not impressive, and said, "Oh, that's nice. Do you work for a firm, or is it more like freelance?" I told her I worked independently. She nodded and turned back to Bryce, what I did not say. That 6 months earlier, I had quietly co-founded a private equity vehicle with 2 colleagues, and that our first fund had just closed at $14 million. What I did not say, that I had recently been approached by the board of Hargrove Medical Center, a regional hospital system in Manhattan, about a significant philanthropic opportunity. What I did not say, that I had spent 3 weeks reviewing their financials and operational reports before agreeing, anonymously, to commit $12 million over 5 years to fund the construction of a new surgical wing. I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in my apartment, with a glass of water and the clanging memory of that Norwalk radiator still somewhere in my chest. The wing would be named the Turner Foundation Surgical Center. Nobody in my family knew the Turner, and that name was me. There was one person I told, my attorney, Rachel Osei, who had handled my affairs for 4 years and who had a talent for keeping her expression completely neutral even when she was surprised. When I told her about the donation, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know your brother works at Hargrove." I said, "I know." She said, "He's going to walk past that name every single day." I said, "I know that too." She wrote something in her notepad and did not ask me anything else. That was the thing about building something in silence. You do not do it to prove a point. Not at first. You do it because silence is the only space that was ever given to you, so you learn to build inside it. But there comes a moment, in every quiet life, when something tips, when the silence stops being protection and starts being a cage. My moment came on a Wednesday evening in March, on the I-95 North, when a car ran a red light and hit the driver's side of my vehicle at 40 miles an hour. I remember the sound before I remember the impact, a sharp, wet crack, like a branch snapping under too much weight, and then the world tilted sideways and there was glass, very briefly, everywhere. Then stillness. The kind of stillness that is so complete it almost has a sound of its own. The paramedics told me later I had been conscious the whole time. I do not remember it that way. I remember pieces, the smell of something burning near the front of the car, a man's voice saying, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The cold of the asphalt through the window that was no longer a window. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that shock sometimes produces, that I had a 4 o'clock call with a client the next morning, and I had not yet reviewed the portfolio notes. They brought me into Hargrove Medical Center's emergency department at 7:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock on the wall when they wheeled me through the doors, and I made myself memorize it. A habit I had developed in my years of financial work: anchor yourself to cutsers when everything else is uncertain. 7:14 p.m. On a Wednesday in March, 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, a laceration above my left eyebrow that had bled considerably but was, the triage nurse assured me, not as serious as it looked. I was going to be fine. What I did not know, lying on that gurney in Bay 4, with a blood pressure cuff on my arm and a paper gown that did not quite close in the back, was that someone had called my mother. My emergency contact on file was outdated. I had meant to change it to Rachel, and had not gotten around to it. So the hospital called the number listed, which was the landline at the Greenwich house, and my mother answered on the third ring, and 25 minutes later she walked through the ER doors, in her camel hair coat, with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and her expression set in the particular arrangement that meant she was inconvenienced. Bryce was with her. He had been at the house for dinner. It was a Wednesday, and he and Candace had a standing Wednesday dinner with my mother, a tradition I had never been invited to join, a fact I had long since stopped caring about. He was still in his dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he walked slightly ahead of my mother, the way he always did in any room, as if he were leading a procession. The nurse pulled back the curtain, and they both looked at me. My mother's eyes moved from my face to the monitor beside the bed, to the IV in my arm, and back to my face. She did not come closer. She stood at the edge of the curtain, one hand holding the other at her waist, and said, "Well, you look like you've been through something," I said. "I was in a car accident," she said. "Yes, they told us." A pause. "Both lanes?" I did not know what that meant. I still do not. Bryce stepped forward and looked at the chart hanging from the foot of the bed, the way doctors look at things that belong to them. He had no privileges at Hargrove. His practice was affiliated with a different hospital system, but old habits move through a person's body without asking permission. He flipped a page, nodded once, said ribs and wrist. Could be worse. Then he set the chart back down and looked at me with the expression he had been giving me my entire life. The expression that said he had already assessed the situation and found it to be, on balance, not that serious. "You're stable," he said. "They'll probably keep you overnight for observation." "Standard protocol," I said. "I know," he said. "You should have been more careful on 95. That stretch near Stamford is brutal, at rush hour." I did not say anything to that. My mother had moved to the single chair in the corner of the bay and was looking at her phone, not scrolling, just looking at it, the way people do when they want an excuse not to be present in a room. After a moment, she looked up and said, "We have the Aldrich dinner tonight. It's been on the calendar since January." I looked at her, "The Aldriches." She said again, as if I had not heard, "Gordon and Patricia, we've been trying to get this reservation for 2 months. It's at 8:30. The clock on the wall said 7:51. I said, "Okay," she said. "The nurses say you're stable. You have insurance." She stood up from the chair and smoothed the front of her coat. "There's really nothing for us to do here, Tiffany. They're going to run some scans. You'll rest. They'll discharge you in the morning." She picked up her handbag. "You can call a cab when you're done." I want to tell you that I said something then. That I found the words. The right words. The ones I had been saving for 32 years. And I said them clearly. In front of the nurse who was standing 3 feet away, pretending to check a monitor and absolutely hearing every syllable of this conversation. I want to tell you, I sat up straight on that gurney and told my mother exactly what I thought of a woman who leaves her daughter in an emergency room to make a dinner reservation. But I did not. I had learned a long time ago that the Turner family did not respond to words. Words could be dismissed. Words could be reframed at the next family gathering as an overreaction, a misunderstanding, a sign that Tiffany had always been a little too sensitive. Words dissolved. What did not dissolve, what could not be argued with, spun, or explained away, was documentation. Evidence, the kind of record that exists in writing, in systems, in the permanent and indifferent memory of institutions. So I said nothing. I watched my mother pull on her gloves. She always wore gloves in March, even when it wasn't that cold. And I watched Bryce give me a short nod, the kind that means take care without meaning it. And I watched them walk back through the curtain and out into the corridor, and I listened to the sound of their footsteps until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then the curtain moved again. But it was not a nurse. It was a man in his early 50s, silver-haired, in a white coat with a badge that read Dr. Elliot Marsh, Chief of Surgery. He had a tablet in his hand, and he was looking at it as he stepped into the bay, and then he looked up, and he saw my name on the whiteboard above my bed, and he stopped. He looked at the whiteboard, then he looked at me. Then back at the whiteboard, he said, "Turner." I said, "S." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not uncertainty but rather a person recalibrating very quickly. Then he pulled the curtain fully closed behind him, set his tablet on the counter, and said, in a voice that was careful and low, "Miss Turner, why didn't anyone notify us? It was you." The nurse at the monitor had gone very still. I looked at Dr. Marsh, and I said, "I didn't think it was necessary." He looked at me for another long moment. Then he said, "Are you in pain?" And I said, "I've been in pain for a long time, Dr. Marsh. Tonight is just the first time it showed up on a chart." He nodded slowly, as if this made complete sense to him. Then he pulled up a chair, sat down beside my bed and said, "Tell me what you need." I did not sleep that night. Not because of the pain, though the ribs made every breath a small negotiation, but because something had shifted inside me in that bay, in that moment after my mother's footsteps faded down the corridor. Something that had been building for years, quietly and without ceremony, the way water builds behind a dam that no one is watching, had reached a line it could not come back from. Dr. Marsh stayed for 40 minutes. He did not ask me about the foundation. Not directly. Not yet. He spoke with the attending physician assigned to my case, reviewed the imaging himself, ordered a second look at the rib scans. He was thorough in the way that people are thorough when something matters to them personally, not just professionally. When he left, he handed me a card with his direct cell number written on the back in ink, and he said, "If anything changes tonight, you call that number, not the nurse's station. That number." I set the card on the tray beside my bed and looked at it for a long time after he was gone. At 10:30, the night nurse, a woman named Gloria, who had the particular brand of warmth that comes from having seen too much to be surprised by any of it, brought me a cup of tea I had not asked for and set it on the tray without comment. She adjusted my IV, checked the monitor, and as she was leaving, she paused at the curtain and said, without turning around, "Those people who were here earlier." I said, "Yes," she said, "they your family?" I said, technically. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, and then she left. I drank the tea. I looked at the ceiling, and somewhere around 11 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been awake. Rachel Osei did not answer calls at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday if she had been asleep. She was the kind of attorney who kept her phone face up on the nightstand and her mind running at a low hum even when her eyes were closed, which is exactly the kind of attorney you want when you have built the life I had built. I told her what had happened, the accident, the ER, my mother's gloves, and the dinner reservation and the cab. Rachel listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. I counted, and then she said, "Are you hurt?" I said, "Cracked ribs. Fractured wrist. I'll be fine," she said. "Okay." Another pause, and Dr. Marsh was there. It was not a question. Rachel knew about Dr. Marsh. Rachel knew about everything. I said, "He came to the bay himself. He gave me his direct number," she said. "Tiffany." Her voice had shifted, not alarm exactly, but attention, the kind that sharpens at a corner. "What are you thinking?" I looked at the card on the tray. The ink was slightly uneven where he'd written the number quickly, pressed down harder on the 7. I said, "I've been anonymous for 4 years, Rachel. I funded a surgical wing, and I let them name it after a foundation so that no one would know it was a person. No one would know it was me." I paused. "My brother walks past that name every single day, and he has never once connected it to his sister. Because his sister, in his mind, is not the kind of person who does things like that." Rachel said no. I said, "My mother left me in an emergency room." Rachel said, "I know." I said, "I think it's time." There was a silence on the line, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of silence between two people who have known each other long enough that it carries weight without needing to be filled. Then Rachel said, "If we do this, we do it right." I said, "When have we ever done it any other way?" She said she would start pulling documents in the morning. The LLC structures, the foundation filings, the board correspondence. She also mentioned, in the careful tone she used when she was about to tell me something I needed to hear clearly, that she had been reviewing the trust fund my grandmother had established before her death. The one my mother had administered for the past 11 years. The one that was meant to be divided equally among her children. I said, "And?" Rachel said, "The distributions have not been equal. I already knew this. I had suspected it for 3 years and confirmed it 18 months ago through a combination of my own financial instincts and a forensic accountant named Dennis, who charged a great deal of money and was worth every cent. What I had not done until that moment was decide to act on it. I said, 'Add it to the file.'" Rachel said, "Consider it done." I could hear her writing. "The gala is in 9 days, the Turner Foundation's annual gala. Hargrove Medical Center's largest fundraising event of the year. Black tie, 400 guests, the kind of evening where the hospital's most significant donors were recognized publicly. Dr. Marsh had invited me 18 months ago. I had declined each time, citing my preference for anonymity. I had not declined this year. I said, "I know," Rachel said. "Your mother and Bryce are on the guest list. Bryce registered as a presenting physician. Your mother registered as his guest." I closed my eyes. The rib on my left side pulled when I breathed too deep, so I kept my breaths shallow and even. I said, "Of course they are." Rachel said, "Do you want me to have them removed?" I thought about it, genuinely considered it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then I said no. Leave them exactly where they are. After I hung up, I lay in the dark and listened to the hospital breathe around me. The distant beeping of monitors, the soft roll of a cart down the corridor, Gloria's shoes on the linoleum. Somewhere down the hall a television was on low, the 11 o'clock news, a voice reading out the weather for the week ahead. I thought about my mother's gloves. I thought about the way Bryce had set my chart back down after reading it. Not gently, just neutrally, the way you set down something that does not belong to you and does not interest you. I thought about a 9-year-old girl standing alone outside a school auditorium after a piano recital, watching the parking lot empty out, counting cars until there were none left, and then I thought about 9 days from now. A ballroom, 400 people. A name on a screen that everyone in that room would recognize, except the 2 people who should have known it first. I reached over with my good hand and turned off the light above the bed. I had work to do. But first, I needed to rest. The dam had held for 32 years. 9 more days was nothing. I was discharged the following morning at 10:47. No cab. Rachel had sent a car. A quiet black sedan with a driver named Paul, who had worked with her firm for 6 years, and who understood, without being told, that the ride from the hospital to my apartment in Stamford was not a time for conversation. He held the door. I got in. We drove in silence through Manhattan traffic and then north on 95 past the stretch near the Stamford exit, where the guardrail on the right shoulder had a fresh scrape of silver paint that had not been there yesterday. I looked at it as we passed. And then I looked away. My apartment was on the 14th floor of a building that had a doorman named Hector and a lobby that smelled faintly of the cleaning solution they used on the marble floors every Tuesday. It was not a showy apartment. I had decorated it carefully and without urgency over 4 years. A few good pieces of furniture, decent art, good light from the east-facing windows. My mother had visited exactly once, 2 years ago, and had stood in the center of the living room and said, "It's smaller than I expected." She had not meant it unkindly. That was the thing about my mother that took me years to fully understand. She did not intend cruelty. She simply moved through the world measuring everything against a standard that had never included me in its calculations. Paul carried my bag up. I thanked him. I locked the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against it. My fractured wrist in its brace, my ribs quietly insisting on being noticed. Then I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. I had 8 days. The first call I made was to Dennis Farrow, the forensic accountant. He had been working on the trust fund analysis for 18 months, cross-referencing distribution records against the original terms of my grandmother, Eleanor Turner's estate. Eleanor had been a precise woman, a retired schoolteacher who had married well and spent 40 years managing her husband's money with a discipline that none of her descendants had inherited, except possibly me. Her will had been specific. The trust was to be divided equally among her grandchildren, upon the death or incapacitation of her surviving children, with distributions in the interim at the discretion of the appointed administrator. My mother was the appointed administrator. Dennis had found, over the course of his review, that over 11 years, the discretionary distributions had not been equal. Bryce had received $340,000 in discretionary payments, school loans retired, a down payment on his first apartment, the seed capital for a small investment he had bragged about at Christmas 3 years running. I had received $14,000, paid out in 2 installments, both in years when I had not spoken to my mother for extended periods, and both in amounts that felt less like generosity and more like insurance against a conversation she did not want to have. The base trust, however, the principle that Eleanor had established and that could not be touched by discretionary distribution, was a different matter. It sat in a structure that my grandmother had been quietly clever about. The principal was held in a vehicle that required the unanimous consent of all named beneficiaries before it could be liquidated or redistributed. My mother had spent 11 years administering the discretionary layer without ever, apparently, reading the base document carefully enough to notice that clause, or perhaps she had noticed. Perhaps she had simply decided that I would never look. Dennis emailed me the summary at noon. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Rachel with a single line, confirmed. Add to package. The second call I made was to Dr. Marsh. He answered immediately, which did not surprise me. We had spoken perhaps a dozen times over the 4 years since I had committed to the foundation, careful, professional conversations about allocation and construction timelines and board priorities. He was a man who chose his words with the same precision he brought to surgery, and he had always treated my anonymity not as an eccentricity to be managed but as a decision to be respected. I said, "Elliot, I want to come out." There was a short pause. Then he said, "At the gala." He said, "Tiffany, are you sure? Once we do this." I said, "I know what it means. I've thought about nothing else since last night." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him breathing, and I imagined him at his desk in that office on the 4th floor, the one with the window that looked out over the East River, doing what he always did when he was thinking seriously, which was to turn his pen end over end between his fingers without looking at it. He said, "I'll need to brief the board chair." I said, "Of course," he said, "and the program. Your name needs to be in the program." I said, "I want it on the screen, Elliot. I want it projected." A silence. Then, I said, "One more thing," he said. "Yes," I said, "my brother Bryce is registered as a presenting physician at the gala." Dr. Marsh said, "He is." I said, "I don't want him removed. I don't want anything changed. I just want you to know. So you are not surprised." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not quite satisfaction, not quite something else, but something that lived in the space between professionalism and being human. He said, "Miss Turner, I will not pretend I don't know what this evening is going to mean for certain people in that room." I said, "I know you won't." He said, "I'll see you Saturday." After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. The east-facing windows had gone from morning light to the flat gray of a March afternoon. My wrist ached in its brace. My ribs had settled into a dull, constant pressure that I was learning to breathe around rather than against. I opened a new document on my laptop and began to work, not on the foundation, not on the trust, on something I had been composing in my head for years, quietly, in the background, the way you hold a thought you are not ready to act on, a full accounting of the Turner Foundation's 4-year history, its funding structure, its impact on Hargrove's surgical capacity, the patient outcomes that had changed because of the wing. Facts. Numbers. The kind of record that exists permanently and cannot be softened by someone else's telling of it. I wanted it finished before Saturday. I wrote for 6 hours, my tea went cold. The light outside shifted from gray to dark. At 9:15, I saved the document, closed the laptop, and went to stand at the east window for a while. The city below was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, luminous. 14 floors up, the sounds were muffled enough that the world had a quality of something seen through glass. Contained, ordered. I had stood at this window many times over 4 years and found it steadying. The city did not care who you were, or what your mother thought of you, or whether your name appeared in a program at a charity gala. The city simply moved, and kept moving, and rewarded the ones who moved with it, in 8 days, in a ballroom on the Upper East Side. A surgeon I trusted was going to stand at a podium and say my name in front of 400 people. My mother would be in the room. My brother would be in the room, and I would be sitting in the front row in a navy dress, with my wrist in a brace and my ribs still healing, looking perfectly, completely calm, because that was the thing about building something in silence for 8 years. When the moment finally came, you were ready. The call came on Friday morning, 6 days after the accident, 2 days before the gala. I was at my desk reviewing the final version of the foundation document when my phone lit up with a number I recognized, the Greenwich House landline, and I sat with it in my hand for 2 full rings before I answered. My mother's voice was bright in the particular way it got when she wanted something. Tiffany, how are you feeling? We've been thinking about you. I noted the we. Bryce was there, or had been recently enough that she felt entitled to speak for him. I said, better. Thank you for calling, she said. Of course. You're our girl. A pause, the kind that precedes the actual reason for the call. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. Are you free for a moment? I said I was. She said, your grandmother's trust. I've been speaking with the estate attorney. Gerald. You remember Gerald? And he's suggested it might be time to do a full review of the structure. Modernize it a little? Rachel Osei called Gerald's office last week asking about the base documents. I kept my voice even. I said, Rachel handles my financial affairs. It's routine, my mother said. Of course, another pause. It's just, Gerald mentioned that the base trust has a consent clause, that any restructuring would require signatures from all beneficiaries. A light laugh, practiced and warm. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page as a family. You know how these things can get complicated, what she was telling me, in the language our family had always used. The language of implication and omission and bright voices over landlines, was this. She knew Rachel had been looking, she was calling to find out how much I knew. And she was floating the word family like a life preserver, the way she always did when she needed me to feel like I belonged to something. I said, I appreciate you reaching out, Mom. I'll have Rachel follow up with Gerald directly. A beat of silence. Then, Tiffany, we don't need to make this into a legal matter, I said. I'm not making it into anything. Rachel's is my attorney. Gerald is the estate attorney. That's how these conversations should happen. I paused. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss? She shifted. I could hear it. The small recalibration that happened when my mother realized a conversation was not going to go the way she had arranged it in her head. I just think it would be nice, she said, more carefully now, if we could sit down together, as a family. Before anyone does anything official, I thought about Bay 4, the camel hair coat, the gloves. Call her a cab when she's done. I said, I'll be in touch, Mom. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk. 20 minutes later, Bryce called. I did not answer. He left a voicemail that I listened to once, standing in my kitchen with a glass of water, and then saved to a folder Rachel had set up for exactly this kind of documentation. His tone was different from my mother's, less bright, more direct, the voice he used when he was operating in professional mode and had decided the most efficient approach was to simply tell people what was going to happen. He said, Tiffany, it's Bryce. Mom mentioned you've had someone looking into Grandma Eleanor's trust. I want to be clear that trust was set up to support this family, and any attempt to renegotiate the structure is going to affect all of us. I've talked to my own attorney, and he agrees that the consent clause doesn't necessarily mean what you might think it means. Call me back. I stood in the kitchen and drank my water and listened to his voice fill my apartment, confident and slightly impatient, explaining to me what words meant, his attorney. I almost smiled. I called Rachel. She answered on the first ring. I played her the voicemail on speaker. When it ended, she said, "He got an attorney." I said, "Apparently," she said, "his attorney is wrong about the consent clause. Completely, unambiguously wrong. The language in Eleanor's document is as clear as trust language gets. Without your signature, nothing moves," I said. "I know," she said. "He's bluffing," I said. "He's always bluffing. He just doesn't know that anyone knows." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "The gala is tomorrow night," I said. "Yes," she said. "I'll have the full trust analysis ready by end of day today, along with the LLC documentation and the foundation filing history. Everything in one package, organized chronologically." A pause. "Dennis finished the forensic summary this morning. The numbers are not good for your mother, Tiffany. 11 years of unequal distribution documented to the dollar." I sat down at my desk. Outside, the March sky was doing something between overcast and clearing, that ambivalent midday light that couldn't commit to either. I said, "How much total?" Rachel said, $326,000. "That's the gap between what Bryce received and what you received in discretionary distributions over 11 years. Adjusted for the time value of money." I said the number, quietly to myself. $326,000. Not a devastating sum in the context of what I had built. But that was not the point. The point was never the money. The point was the 11 years of my mother, looking me in the eye at Christmas dinners and birthday calls, and one emergency room in March, treating me like someone whose absence from the family ledger was natural and appropriate and unremarkable. The point was the decision. Made deliberately, sustained deliberately, hidden deliberately. I said, "Rachel, I want the package sent to Gerald's office Monday morning." She said, "Done," I said, "and I want a letter drafted from you to my mother and Bryce, notifying them that I will not be signing any consent to restructure the base trust. Not now. Not under the current circumstances." Rachel said, "Also done." I said, "One more thing." She said, "Always." I said, "Bryce's affiliation at Hargrove, his presenting physician registration for the gala tomorrow. I want to know exactly what that entitles him to." I heard Rachel typing. After a moment she said, "Presenting physicians at the Hargrove Gala receive a featured table for 4, recognition in the printed program, and the opportunity to speak briefly about their department's work. It's a visibility event. Good for their professional profile." I thought about Bryce in his dress shirt at the dinner table, setting down my chart with that neutral, dismissive hand. I said, "So he's going to stand up tomorrow night, in that ballroom, in front of 400 people, and speak about his work at Hargrove Medical Center." Rachel said, "That was the plan." "Yes," I said. "And then the foundation segment happens." Rachel said very quietly, "Yes." I said, "Good." That afternoon, I went to my closet and stood in front of it for a long time. The navy dress I had chosen for the gala was hanging near the back. A simple cut, structured shoulders, the kind of dress that does not announce itself but reads, in a room full of people who understand these things, as exactly correct. I had bought it 8 months ago, before I had decided to come out of anonymity, before the accident, before any of this. I had bought it because I liked it. I took it off the hanger and hung it on the back of the door where I would see it in the morning. My wrist brace was navy too, as it happened. I had not planned that. I made tea, sat at the window, and watched the light over Stamford go from afternoon to early evening. My phone buzzed twice more that day. Once from a number I didn't recognize that I assumed was Bryce's attorney. Once from my mother again, a text this time that said simply, "Please call me when you can." It would mean a lot. I read it. I set the phone down. There would be time for all of it. There would be time for the letters and the attorneys and the long, careful conversations that would restructure what remained of my relationship with my family into something honest if smaller. But that was for after. Tomorrow night I had somewhere to be. I woke at 6 on Saturday morning without an alarm. The ribs had settled into something manageable overnight. A tightness rather than a pain. The kind of thing you notice at the edges of a breath rather than the center of it. I lay still for a few minutes in the gray early light, taking inventory the way I had learned to do after the accident. Wrist, ribs, the small cut above my eyebrow now reduced to a thin red line that foundation would cover. I was functional, I was steady. That was enough. I made coffee and stood at the east window while the city assembled itself below. At 7:15, Candace called. I stood and watched my phone light up with her name, Candace Turner. And for a moment I simply observed the fact of it, the way you observe an unexpected weather event. Candace had called me perhaps 4 times in the 6 years she had been married to my brother, and each call had been framed as social but structured around information extraction. She was not unintelligent. She was, in her way, very good at what she did, which was to manage the social perimeter of Bryce's life with the thoroughness of someone who understood that image was infrastructure. I answered. She said, "Tiffany, I'm so glad I caught you. How is the wrist?" I said it was healing well. She said, "Good, good, we've been worried," a breath, quick, preparatory. "Listen, I'm going to be direct with you because I think that's what the situation calls for." I said, "Please," she said. "Bryce got a call yesterday from someone at the Hargrove board about the gala tonight. They were asking questions about his departmental affiliation, about his tenure there, some administrative thing." Her voice had the careful steadiness of someone reading from a script they had rehearsed but were pretending they hadn't. "He's been at Hargrove for 4 years, Tiffany. He's built something real there, and if you have some kind of issue with the family, with the trust, with whatever Rachel Osei is digging into, I want us to handle it like adults. Privately, not in a way that affects Bryce's career." I let a moment pass. I said, "Candace, I don't have an issue with Bryce's career," she said. "Then what is this about?" I said. "This is about a foundation gala I've been invited to attend. I'm going as a guest of Dr. Marsh." Silence. I could hear her processing this, the specific weight of guest of Dr. Marsh landing in the space between us. She said, "You know Elliot Marsh?" I said, "Yes." Another silence, longer. "Then how?" I said. "Through philanthropic work. We've collaborated for a few years." The lines was very quiet. I could hear faintly the sound of their house in the background, the Greenwich house. The same one I had grown up beside in spirit, if not always in warmth, the fountain in the driveway that my mother had imported from Tuscany. I imagined Candace standing in the kitchen with her coffee going cold, her very good brain working through the implications of what I had just said, and arriving, for the first time, at the edge of a question she did not yet know how to ask. She said, "Tiffany." I said, "I'll see you tonight, Candace. I'm sure it'll be a lovely evening." I ended the call. I finished my coffee. I showered carefully, working around the brace, letting the water run hot until the tension in my shoulders loosened by a degree. I dried my hair and did my makeup slowly, the way I did everything that mattered. Without rushing, without anxiety, simply moving through each step with the attention it deserved. The cut above my eyebrow was barely visible under foundation. At 9:30, Rachel called. She said, "The package is ready. Full trust analysis, LLC documentation, foundation filings, Dennis's forensic summary, the distribution gap calculation, everything organized and indexed." A pause. "Gerald's office will have it Monday morning." I said. "Good," she said. "I also want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as your attorney and as someone who has watched you build this for 8 years. Another pause. "What you have done, Tiffany, the foundation, the structure, the way you've insulated everything, it is airtight. There is no angle from which your mother or Bryce can come at this and find purchase. The LLC is clean, the trust language is clear, the foundation filings are public record. If they want to fight, they will lose, and they will lose expensively and publicly." I said, "I know." She said, "I just wanted you to hear it out loud." Before tonight, I thanked her and hung up. At noon, a text arrived from a number I had blocked 3 days prior. My phone still showed the preview in the notification bar before I could dismiss it. It was from Bryce. "Tiff, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. You're about to make a decision you can't undo. Call me." I screenshotted it and emailed it to Rachel's documentation folder. Then I blocked the number again and set my phone face down. What my brother did not understand, what he had never understood, in 32 years of being the point of the family while I was the footnote, was that I had already made every decision. I had made them slowly and carefully over 8 years, in apartments he had never visited, in meetings he had never known about, in the long quiet hours after family dinners, where I had driven home alone and sat at my desk and worked. The decisions were done. The architecture was built. What was happening now was not a decision, it was a delivery. At 2 in the afternoon, I received a call from a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man who identified himself as Kenneth Hale, attorney at law, representing Bryce and Diana Turner in a matter relating to the Eleanor Turner Trust. His voice was measured and professional. He said he was reaching out as a courtesy to suggest that all parties might benefit from a conversation before any documentation was formally submitted. He said the word courtesy twice. He said the word family 3 times. He said that his clients were open to discussing a. And here he paused, selecting the word carefully, recalibration of the historical distribution structure, in a spirit of goodwill and mutual resolution. I listened to the entire message. Then I forwarded it to Rachel with 2 words. Document this. She replied in 4 minutes. Already on it. Also, Kenneth Hale is not a trust attorney. He's a general practice litigator from Stamford. They are improvising. I read her message and felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the feeling of watching a projection confirm what the calculation already told you. They were improvising because they were afraid, and they were afraid because the board contact had rattled Bryce. And Bryce had rattled Diana. And Diana had called Candace, and now all of them were pulling in the same direction with the specific energy of people who sense that something is about to happen and do not know how to stop it. They could not stop it. It had already happened. 8 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, when I signed a document alone in an apartment with a clanging radiator and a glass of water. The outcome of tonight had already been determined. Every phone call, every text, every attorney they hired, and every word they chose was happening in such a structure I had already built around them. At 4 o'clock, I put on the navy dress. It fit exactly as I had remembered. Structured shoulders, clean line, the kind of dress that in a room full of people who understood these things would read as exactly correct. I put on the wrist brace, which was also navy, which I had still not planned. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. The dress, the brace, the thin-heeled line above my eyebrow, the face of a woman who had been called a cab and had spent the intervening week building the vehicle that was about to arrive. Paul was downstairs at 5:45 with the black sedan, engine running. I picked up my bag, checked that my phone was charged, and took one last look at the east window and the city below it. Then I turned off the light and went to meet the evening I had been preparing for 8 years. The Hargrove Medical Center annual gala was held at the Carlisle on Madison Avenue. I had been inside the ballroom once before, 2 years ago, when Dr. Marsh had taken me on a private tour of the venue during the planning phase for what would become the foundation's flagship evening. I remembered the chandeliers, the way they threw lighted angles that made everyone in the room look like they were standing inside something significant. I remembered thinking it was a good room for a reveal. High ceilings, good acoustics, the kind of space where a name, spoken clearly into a microphone, would travel to every corner without effort. Paul pulled up to the entrance at 6:48. I sat in the back seat for exactly 1 moment. Not hesitation, just the breath before a thing begins. And then I got out. The lobby was already moving with people in black tie, the particular social current of a charity evening in full assembly. Women in floor-length gowns, comparing earrings, men in tuxedos, finding their colleagues across rooms, the low percussion of 400 conversations beginning to organize themselves. A Hargrove staff member in a headset met me at the door with a smile and a lanyard and said, "Miss Turner, Dr. Marsh asked me to bring you directly to him." I said, "Thank you." We moved through the lobby and into a side corridor, away from the gathering current, toward a small reception room near the stage entrance. Dr. Marsh was there with the board chair, a woman named Sylvia Cho, who had the compact, deliberate energy of someone who had run large institutions for a long time and trusted very few people. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "Miss Turner, it is genuinely an honor." I said, "Thank you for having me, Sylvia." She held my hand a moment longer than a standard handshake and looked at me with the expression of someone who had spent 2 years being told that the Turner Foundation's anonymous donor was a private individual and had, until very recently, imagined that individual as someone much older. She said, "I have to ask." "Why now?" I said. "Someone called me a cab." She looked at me. Then she laughed, a real one, short and surprised. Dr. Marsh, standing slightly behind her, pressed his lips together in what was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. We went over the program. My segment was the third item in the main presentation. After the hospital's annual report summary and before the department recognition, Dr. Marsh would introduce the Turner Foundation, present the 4-year impact figures, 2,400 additional surgical procedures in year 1 of the new wing, a 34% reduction in patient transfer rates, 3 new fellowship positions funded, and then call my name. I would walk from my seat in the front row to the stage. That was all. I did not need to give a speech. The facts would speak. They always had. Dr. Marsh said, "Your table is front row, center. You'll be seated before the doors open to general admission," I said. "And my brother's table?" He consulted the seating chart on his tablet. Table 14. Left side, fourth row back. Clear sightline to the stage. I nodded. He said quietly, "Tiffany, are you ready for what's going to happen in that room tonight?" I thought about it honestly, the way I always tried to think about important questions, without performance, without the answer I was supposed to give. I said, "I've been ready for 8 years. I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." He nodded once. Then the staff member with the headset appeared at the door and said the general doors were opening in 4 minutes. I went to my seat. The ballroom filled around me the way a tide comes in, gradually and then completely. I sat with my hands in my lap and my brace resting against the white tablecloth, and I watched the room assemble without watching any single part of it. Sylvia Cho took the seat to my left, an oncologist named Dr. Patricia Webb, who I had met briefly at a foundation planning meeting 18 months ago, took the seat to my right and squeezed my arm gently and said nothing, which was exactly right. At 7:22, I saw them come in. My mother first, Diana Turner in a dove gray gown, her hair set the way she wore it for important occasions, her posture the particular straightness of a woman who has spent 60 years treating every room she entered as a room she was meant to be noticed in. Behind her, Bryce in his tuxedo, Candace on his arm in emerald green, and behind them 2 of Bryce's colleagues from the orthopedic department, laughing at something one of them had said in the lobby. They were directed to table 14. My mother scanned the room the way she always did upon entering, a rapid, practiced assessment of who was present and where they were positioned relative to where she was positioned. Her gaze moved across the front tables without stopping. The way you scan past things that do not register as significant. She did not see me. I watched her sit down. I watched Bryce pull out Candace's chair and take his own seat and pick up the program from the table and open it with the comfortable authority of a man who had attended many events like this and expected to be recognized at this one. I turned back to face the stage. At 7:45, the lights shifted and Sylvia Cho walked to the podium to welcome the room. She was precise and warm in equal measure. She covered the year's operational highlights in 8 minutes. Numbers I knew well, had helped make possible, had read in quarterly reports for 4 years. The room listened with the attentive half-presence of a gala audience, engaged enough to applaud at the right moments, relaxed enough to refill their wine. Then the department recognition segment. 5 physicians were called to the front, one at a time, to brief applause and the flash of table cameras. Bryce was the 4th. He walked to the podium with his particular gait, shoulders back, unhurried, the walk of a man who had been the point of every room he'd entered since he was 8 years old. He spoke for 3 minutes about the orthopedic department's volume numbers and a new minimally invasive procedure his team had pioneered. He was polished. He was confident. He thanked Hargrove for the platform. He walked back to table 14 to applause. He did not look at the front row. Then Dr. Marsh stood up. The room shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way a room shifts when the person who matters most in it takes the floor. Dr. Marsh had that quality. He did not perform authority. He simply had it, and rooms recognized it without being told. He said, "I want to take a few minutes to talk about something that has quietly transformed this institution over the past 4 years. Something that most of you in this room, including many of our own staff, have benefited from without knowing its full story." He paused. The room was very still. He said, 4 years ago, Hargrove Medical Center received a philanthropic commitment of $12 million, earmarked for the construction of what is now our Turner Foundation Surgical Center, the wing that currently handles 40% of our inpatient surgical volume and houses 3 of our most advanced operating theaters. A murmur moved through the room. Not surprise exactly. The wing was known. Its name was on the wall. But the specificity of the number, spoken plainly, recalibrated something. He said this gift was made anonymously. The donor asked for no recognition, attended no events, and for 4 years allowed this institution to benefit from their generosity, without knowing who they were thanking. He looked up from his notes. He said, "Tonight, that changes." I felt Sylvia Cho shift slightly beside me. Dr. Webb put down her wine glass. Dr. Marsh said, "The Turner Foundation was established and funded entirely by one person. a financial professional who built her career quietly over 8 years without asking anyone for recognition or assistance. Someone who believed that the best investments are the ones made in institutions that serve people at their most vulnerable. He paused. Her name is Tiffany Turner. He looked directly at me. Tiffany, would you please come up? I stood. The applause began before I had fully risen from my chair. Immediate, full, the kind that fills a room from the bottom up. I walked from the front row to the stage with my navy dress and my navy brace and my heeled eyebrow and the complete, settled calm of someone who had been moving toward this moment for 8 years, without knowing exactly what it would look like. I shook Dr. Marsh's hand. I turned to face the room, 400 people on their feet, and at table 14, fourth row back, left side, a clear sightline to the stage. I saw my brother Bryce stand up with everyone else, his program still in his hand, his face the color of the white tablecloth beneath it. He was looking at the screen behind me, where my name was projected in letters 3 feet tall, and I watched the moment, the exact, specific, irrevocable moment, when he understood. I stood at that microphone for perhaps 30 seconds before I spoke, not because I was gathering myself. I had been gathered for 8 years. But because I had learned, in a long career of reading rooms and understanding the architecture of moments, that silence is its own instrument. That 30 seconds of a woman standing still at a podium, looking out at 400 people who have just heard her name for the first time, is worth more than the first sentence of any speech, so I let the room sit with it. The applause had crested and was beginning to soften into the particular quiet of an audience that has arrived somewhere unexpected and is waiting to understand where they are. I could see faces clearly from the stage, the warm overhead light that made everything in the ballroom visible in the way that mattered, not flattering exactly, but honest. I found table 14 without looking for it. Bryce was still standing. He had not sat back down with the rest of the room. His program was in his hand, and his face had not recovered its color, and he was looking at the screen behind me with the expression of a man trying to solve an equation he does not have all the variables for. Candace had her hand on his arm. I could see the tension in her fingers from 40 feet away. The grip of someone trying to keep something in place that is already moving. My mother was seated. She was the only person at table 14 who had not risen for the applause, which I noticed and filed away without judgment. She was sitting very straight in her dove-gray gown, with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before in 32 years, not anger, not shame, something quieter than both. Recognition. I said thank you, my voice was steady. I had not been afraid it wouldn't be, I said. 4 years ago, I sat in a conference room 2 blocks from this building and reviewed Hargrove Medical Center's financial statements, operational reports, and patient outcome data for 3 weeks before I made a decision. That is how I approach every investment. Not with sentiment. With evidence, a pause. What the evidence told me was that this institution was doing extraordinary work with insufficient infrastructure. That the gap between what Hargrove's surgical teams were capable of and what they were equipped to do was costing patients. Not in dramatic ways that make headlines, but in the quiet, accumulated ways that don't. Longer wait times, transfer rates, procedures deferred. I looked at Dr. Marsh briefly. Dr. Marsh showed me the data. I trusted the data, and I made the commitment, applause brief and warm. I let it pass, I said. I asked to remain anonymous because I did not build this foundation for recognition. I built it because I believe that the most important investments are the ones made in the infrastructure of care, in the places where people go when they have no other options. When they are frightened, when they need someone to show up, I let that land. I said, I was in this hospital 10 days ago. Not as a donor. As a patient. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Not loud, just present, like a current under still water. I was brought into the emergency department after a car accident, 2 cracked ribs. A fractured wrist. I lifted my braced hands slightly, not for effect, just as information. I was treated with extraordinary care by the staff of this institution. And I want to say that publicly, because the people who work in this building deserve to hear it said in a room this size. The applause this time was different. Fuller, more immediate. Coming from the floor staff and junior physicians seated toward the back of the room who straightened when they heard it. I said, the Turner Foundation Surgical Center has, in its first 4 years, enabled 2,400 additional surgical procedures annually. It has reduced patient transfer rates by 34%. It has funded 3 fellowship positions that have brought exceptional physicians to this institution. I paused. Those are not my numbers. Those are Dr. Marsh's numbers, and the board's numbers, and the numbers of every surgeon and nurse and technician who showed up to that wing every day and did the work. Another pause. I just paid for the building. Laughter, genuine and warm, I said, I am stepping out of anonymity tonight because I believe that the next phase of this foundation's work requires a name attached to it, a face. A person who can sit across a table and make the case for what continued investment in this institution means, for the patients who need it. I looked out at the room. And also, if I am being completely honest, because someone recently reminded me that there are moments when silence stops being a choice and becomes a habit. And habits, unlike choices, are worth examining. I looked at table 14, not for long. A second, maybe less. But I looked directly at it, and the people at that table knew I was looking, and the people around that table saw where I was looking, and the moment existed in the room as clearly as anything I had said into the microphone. Then I looked back at Dr. Marsh and I said, Thank you for the last 4 years, Elliot. It has been the best investment I've ever made. I stepped back from the microphone. The room came to its feet again, faster this time, more complete. The kind of standing ovation that is not polite but actual, that happens when a room decides something together without discussing it. I shook Dr. Marsh's hand. I shook Sylvia Cho's hand. I walked back down the 3 steps from the stage and returned to my seat in the front row, and Dr. Patricia Webb leaned over and said quietly into my ear, That was one of the finest things I have ever watched anyone do in this room, I said. Thank you, Patricia? I picked up my water glass and drank. The program continued. A string quartet played during the dinner service. The room reorganized itself into the social current of a gala in its second act, movement between tables, the exchange of cards, the low hum of conversation that follows something significant and needs to process it through talk. I stayed in my seat for the first 20 minutes of dinner. People came to me. That was the thing I had not fully anticipated, not the volume of it, but the quality. Physicians whose names I recognized from operational reports but had never met. Board members who had spent 4 years thanking an anonymous foundation and now had a face to attach to the gratitude. A woman whose husband had undergone cardiac surgery in the Turner wing 8 months ago, who had been seated 3 tables back, and who came to me with her eyes bright and took my hand and said simply, "Thank you." He is well. I held her hand and said, I'm very glad. She went back to her table. I looked at my water glass and kept my face composed, because I was not going to cry at the Carlisle on Madison Avenue in a room with 400 people. But the woman's face stayed with me. The specific, uncomplicated gratitude of someone whose life had been changed by a building that existed because of a decision I made alone in an apartment in Stamford, with a glass of water and the memory of a clanging radiator. That was the thing about building something in silence. You sometimes forgot what it was actually for. At 8:47, I saw Bryce stand up from table 14. He was moving with purpose. The specific, contained purpose of a man who has decided on a course of action and is executing it before he can reconsider. Candace reached for his arm. He said something to her without turning his head and she let go. He was moving toward the stage area, toward the side corridor where the reception room was, toward Dr. Marsh, who had moved in that direction 10 minutes ago. I watched him go, then I stood up, excused myself from Patricia Webb, and followed. The side corridor was narrow and lit differently from the ballroom, fluorescent overhead rather than chandelier warm, the functional, back-of-house lighting of a venue that does not expect its guests to see this part. Bryce had found Dr. Marsh near the reception room door and was speaking to him with his shoulders squared and his voice at the careful low register of a man who is trying to have a private conversation in a public place. I stopped at the entrance to the corridor and listened. Bryce was saying, Appreciate the recognition tonight, Elliot, but I think there are some things about my family situation that the board should be aware of before. Dr. Marsh said, Bryce said, I'm just saying that there are complexities here that, Dr. Marsh said, Bryce, quieter this time, and with a quality that stopped the sentence. I stepped into the corridor. Bryce heard my footsteps and turned. For a moment we simply looked at each other. My brother and I, in a fluorescent-lit hallway behind a ballroom where 400 people were eating dinner, 32 years of the particular dynamic of our family arranged in the space between us. He said, Tiffany, I said, Bryce. He looked at me with the expression he had been wearing since the screen lit up. That unresolved equation, the variables still not adding up. Then he said, in a voice that was lower than his usual register and not quite steady, "When did you do all this?" I said, "A long time ago," he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" And I looked at my brother, at the man who had set down my chart in Bay 4 without gentleness and told me I should have been more careful on 95, and I said, "Because no one in our family ever asked." The corridor was very quiet. Dr. Marsh had taken a step back. Not leaving, just creating space, the practiced instinct of a surgeon who knows when to give a wound room. Bryce looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that I did not have a name for, and had never seen there before. Then his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen. His face went a shade paler than it had been. He looked up at Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh said quietly, "The board chair has asked to meet with you Monday morning, Bryce. 9 o'clock. A pause. I'd suggest you bring your department head." Bryce's jaw tightened. He looked at me once more. Then he turned and walked back toward the ballroom. I watched him go. Dr. Marsh came to stand beside me. We stood in the fluorescent corridor in silence for a moment. He said, "How do you feel?" "I thought about it," I said, like someone who just finished a very long project. He almost smiled. We went back to the ballroom. The ballroom had not changed in the 20 minutes I had been gone from it. The string quartet was playing something I recognized distantly. Debussy, I thought, or something that wanted to be Debussy. And the dinner service was in its final pass, dessert plates being cleared with the practiced silence of staff, who understood that the social temperature of the evening was still rising and did not want to interrupt it. 400 people in black tie, wine glasses refilling, the warm cumulative noise of a room that had witnessed something and was still processing it through conversation. I returned to my seat. Bryce was back at table 14. He had not retaken his dinner posture, the easy, shoulder-back comfort of a man in his natural habitat. He was sitting differently now. Straighter than usual, but without authority in it, the straightness of someone holding themselves together rather than projecting. Candace was speaking to him, with her head slightly turned, her voice low. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the tablecloth. My mother was looking at me. Across the room, across 40 feet of Carlisle ballroom, and 400 people and 32 years, my mother was looking directly at me with the expression I had seen in the corridor of her face at the moment of recognition. It had not changed. It was the face of a woman who had spent decades operating on a set of assumptions about the world, and had, in the space of one gala program, discovered that the assumptions were wrong. I looked back at her. I did not look away first. I let the moment be what it was. Then Patricia Webb said something to me about the fellowship program, and I turned to answer her, and the moment ended. At 9:23, Rachel texted, "Kenneth Hale just called Gerald's office. Left a message. Diana and Bryce want to discuss a settlement arrangement. Gerald will document and forward." I typed back, "Thank you," she replied. "How's the room?" I looked out at the ballroom. The chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the faces of people who had spent the evening in the company of something that felt, despite the occasion, genuine, I typed. "The room is good." At 9:40, Sylvia Cho tapped her wine glass and rose for brief closing remarks. She thanked the donors, the staff, the presenting physicians, a gesture in Bryce's direction that he received with a short nod and nothing else, and she said, with a particular emphasis, that the room understood that the evening had been made possible in large part by the continued commitment of the Turner Foundation, and that she hoped this would be the first of many years in which its founder was present to see the work she had made possible. Applause. I looked at my water glass. At 10 o'clock, the formal program concluded, and the room shifted into its final register, the lingering social hour of a gala winding down, people gathering coats and saying their goodbyes in the warm, slightly wine-softened way that follows a long and significant evening. I was speaking with the hospital's chief nursing officer, a woman named Sandra Park, who had spent 15 years building Hargrove's post-operative care protocols, when I saw my mother stand up from table 14 and begin moving through the room toward me. I finished my sentence to Sandra. I shook her hand, I thanked her, and then I turned, and my mother was there. She was still in the dove-gray gown. Her posture was what it always was, the straight-backed bearing of a woman who had spent 60 years treating her own presence as a statement. But something in it was different tonight. The authority of it was unchanged. The assurance beneath the authority was not. She said, "Tiffany." I said, "Mom." She looked at me for a moment. Around us, People moved and talked and gathered their things, the ordinary gentle chaos of a room ending its evening. No one was watching us specifically. We were simply two women in a ballroom, standing close. She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "The foundation." All of it, a pause. Her hands were at her sides, not folded, which was unusual. I genuinely did not know. I said, "I believe you." She looked at me with something unreadable and then said, very quietly, "When did you become all of this?" I thought about the question. I thought about the parking lot outside the piano recital, the bus I took to school, the radiator in Norwalk that clanged at 2 in the morning while I tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet. The Tuesday afternoon, I signed a document alone with a glass of water. I said, "I've always been all of this, Mom. You just weren't looking." She did not answer that. She stood with it for a moment, the way a person stands with something they cannot put down but do not know how to carry. Then she said, "The trust." Rachel's attorney reached out to Gerald. I said yes. She said, "Is there a way to—" I said, "Rachel will handle everything through the proper channels. That's what she's there for." I paused. "It will be fair. I'm not interested in anything that isn't fair." My mother looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were dry, but something in them was working. Some internal adjustment happening that I could see but could not name. She said, "I should have come back that night." In the hospital. I said, "Yes, you should have." She said, "I'm sorry, Tiffany." The words were plain and unadorned, which was not my mother's usual register. She was a woman of elaborate social language, of implications and framings, and the strategic deployment of warmth. Plain and unadorned was not her instrument. I thought it might be the most honest thing she had said to me in 32 years. I said, "I hear you. I did not say I forgive you, because forgiveness is not a thing you can give in a ballroom in an evening gown while the string quartet is packing up. It is a thing that happens slowly, or doesn't, on its own schedule." What I gave her instead was the truth, that I had heard her, that the words existed now in the record between us, and I think she understood the difference. She nodded once. Then she said goodnight and moved back through the thinning room toward the coat check, and I watched her go until she was gone. Bryce did not come to find me. I had not expected him to. Bryce would need time, more time than a gala evening, more time probably than a season, to move through what had happened and arrive at something resembling accountability. That was his work to do. I could not do it for him and had no interest in trying. What I knew was this. At 9 o'clock on Monday morning, he was meeting with the Hargrove board chair, and what happened in that meeting would determine the shape of his professional life at this institution. The board's relationship with the Turner Foundation was not transactional. Dr. Marsh had made that clear over 4 years, but it was also not without weight. Bryce had spent 4 years walking past a wing with my name on it, and feeling nothing in particular about it. He would spend the rest of his time at Hargrove, walking past it, knowing exactly what it meant. That was consequence enough. At 10:35, I collected my coat from the coat check and found Paul waiting outside on Madison Avenue, with the black sedan and the engine running. The March night had gone cold and clear, the kind of New York night where the air feels cleaned and the city lights are sharper than usual. I got in. Paul said, "Good evening, Miss Turner." I said, "Good evening, Paul." He pulled into traffic. I sat back against the seat and looked out the window at Madison Avenue moving past. The storefronts closed and lit from within, the other cars, the particular nighttime quality of a city that does not stop, that simply shifts registers between day and dark and keeps moving. My phone buzzed, a text from a number I did not recognize. I opened it and read it once. It was from Kenneth Hale. "Attorney at law," it said, "Miss Turner. My clients have authorized me to open settlement discussions regarding the Eleanor Turner Trust at your earliest convenience. Please have your attorney contact my office." I read it twice, then I forwarded it to Rachel with one line, "Monday. Your timeline, your terms." She replied in 3 minutes, which meant she was awake and had been waiting. "Understood. Get some rest." I put my phone in my bag. Outside, Madison Avenue gave way to the ramp onto the FDR, and then the river was on my right, dark and wide and moving in its permanent, indifferent way toward wherever rivers go when no one is watching them. I had driven past this river hundreds of times in 8 years and never thought much about it. Tonight it looked different. Not dramatic, just present, the way things look when you have finished carrying something heavy and your hands are finally free to notice the world around them. I rested my head back against the seat. My wrist ached in its brace. My ribs had held up through the evening, but were now, in the quiet of the car, making their presence known again. That dull, insistent pressure that had become familiar enough over the past 10 days to feel almost like company. I was tired. The good kind. The kind that follows completion rather than defeat. I thought about the woman whose husband had undergone surgery in the Turner wing. The way she had taken my hand without ceremony and said he is well. I thought about Sandra Park and 15 years of post-operative protocols. I thought about Dr. Marsh in Bay 4. Pulling up a chair beside my gurney and saying, "Tell me what you need." I thought about a lot of things on that drive home. But what stayed with me, what I carried up the elevator and into my apartment and set down finally on the kitchen counter, like something I had been holding across a very long distance, was not the ballroom, or my name on the screen, or my mother's plain and unadorned apology. It was the clock on the wall of the emergency department, 7:14 p.m. on a Wednesday in March. The moment before Dr. Marsh walked through the curtain. The moment when I was alone, in a paper gown, with 2 cracked ribs and a fractured wrist, and a door still swinging from the weight of my mother's departure. And I had looked at the nurse and said, "There's no one," and then there was. That was where it had started, really. Not 8 years ago. Not the foundation, not the LLC, not the Tuesday afternoon with the glass of water. There, in that bay, in that specific and clarifying loneliness, the decision had finally become undeniable. You build things in silence for a long time, and then one night, in a room full of people, the silence ends. 6 months later, I bought a house, not a large one, not a statement. A 3-bedroom colonial on half an acre in Westport, Connecticut, with a porch that faced east, and a kitchen that got good morning light, and a backyard where someone had planted a row of old hydrangeas that had clearly been there for decades and had opinions about being moved. I bought it because I had been in the Stamford apartment for 4 years, and it had been right for that chapter. The east-facing window, the doorman named Hector, the lobby that smelled of Tuesday morning cleaning solution. But chapters end, and you know when they do. I signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon with Rachel beside me, and a pen that skipped on the last page and had to be pressed down twice to leave a mark. Rachel said, "Congratulations." I said, "Thank you." She said, "The hydrangeas are a liability." I said, "I know. I like them anyway." She smiled, which was not something Rachel did often or carelessly. And we drove back to her office, and I sat across from her desk, and we went through everything that had happened in the 6 months since the gala, item by item. The way you go through the contents of a room you are finally ready to clear. The Eleanor Turner Trust had been formally restructured in April. The settlement, negotiated between Rachel and Kenneth Hale over 3 weeks in February and March, had been precise and unhurried. The principle was preserved intact. The historical distribution gap, $326,000, as Dennis had calculated, adjusted for time value, was remedied through a structured rebalancing that did not require anyone to write a check, but did require signatures, documentation, and the formal acknowledgement, in writing, that the prior distributions had not been equal. My mother had signed. Bryce had signed. Gerald, the estate attorney, had filed everything with the probate court and sent me a copy by certified mail. I had read it once, filed it, and not looked at it again. Bryce's meeting with the Hargrove board chair had taken place on the Monday following the gala, as scheduled. I did not attend and was not consulted. That had been my explicit instruction to Dr. Marsh, who had respected it without question. What I knew was what Dr. Marsh told me afterward in a brief phone call. Bryce had been asked to step down as department head. He remained on staff as an attending orthopedic surgeon, his clinical privileges intact, but the administrative role was gone. The board had been clear that the decision was not punitive but structural. A reassessment of departmental leadership in light of the institution's evolving priority. Bryce had not called me afterward. He had sent a text. 3 weeks later that said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the corridor. About no one ever asking. I don't have a response to that yet, but I wanted you to know I'm thinking about it." I had read it 3 times. I had not responded immediately. I had waited 2 days, and then I had written back. "That's enough for now." It was the truth. Some repairs do not begin with a conversation. They begin with a person sitting alone with something they cannot put down, turning it over until it changes shape. I did not know what Bryce would do with what he was carrying. I knew that he was carrying it, and that was a beginning I had not had before. Candace had sent a card, an actual card, handwritten on her monogrammed stationery. It said, "Tiffany, I owe you an apology I don't yet know how to give properly. I am working on it. Her handwriting was smaller than I expected, and neater, and the last sentence had been written and then slightly corrected mid-word, as if she had started one version and changed to another. I kept the card. My mother and I had lunch in April, not at a club, not at a restaurant she had chosen to be seen in. She had suggested a place in Greenwich I had never been, a small Italian spot on a side street with 8 tables and no valet and a menu that hadn't changed since 1987. She was there when I arrived, already seated, without her coat on, without her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked smaller than she did at events. Not diminished, just human-scaled, the way people look when you take away the rooms they used to be large in. We talked for 2 hours, not about the trust, not about the foundation, not about the gala. We talked about my grandmother Eleanor, about the woman my mother had grown up with, the precision of her, the discipline, the way she had kept every receipt for 40 years in a shoebox organized by year. My mother said, She would have liked you. She would have recognized you immediately." I said, "What do you mean?" My mother said, "She built things quietly too. She never told anyone what she was doing until it was done." A pause. She looked at her water glass. "I never understood that about her when I was young. I thought it was secretive. I thought she was withholding." She looked up. "I think now she was just protecting the work." I did not say anything. My mother said, "I think I made the same mistake with you." We ate our pasta. The restaurant was warm and slightly too close, the way old Italian restaurants are, and the owner came by twice to refill the bread without being asked. Outside the window, a Greenwich afternoon moved through its ordinary paces. A woman walking a dog, a delivery truck, 2 teenagers on their phones. It was not a reconciliation. That word implies a return to a prior state, and the prior state between my mother and me had never been what it should have been. What it was a beginning. A first honest conversation between 2 women who shared a bloodline and a name and a very long history of not quite seeing each other. I drove home from that lunch and sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. Then I started it and drove back to Stamford. The Turner Foundation had, by summer, committed to a second phase of support at Hargrove, a $6 million pledge toward the oncology wing expansion that Sandra Park had been advocating for. I had come out of anonymity for the foundation work entirely now, attending quarterly board meetings, speaking at 2 additional fundraising events, meeting with the fellowship recipients in June over coffee in Dr. Marsh's conference room. The fellows were young, late 20s, early 30s, and they were extraordinary. There was a surgical resident named Marcus who had grown up in the Bronx and had wanted to be a surgeon since he was 11 and had worked 3 jobs through medical school. There was a cardiothoracic fellow named Priya, who had done her residency at a hospital in Chennai before coming to Hargrove, and who had in her first year pioneered a modification to a standard repair procedure that had reduced complications in pediatric cases by 22%. I sat across the table from them and listened to them talk about their work, and I thought about Eleanor Turner's shoebox of receipts, organized by year, the things you build quietly, the people they reach. In August, I went back to the hospital, not as a patient, not as a donor. I asked Dr. Marsh if I could walk through the Turner Foundation's surgical center on a regular operating day. Not a tour, not a presentation, just a walkthrough, observer status, the kind of presence that doesn't interrupt anything. He said yes. I spent 3 hours moving through the wing on a Tuesday morning, or suites running at capacity. The recovery ward full and attentive, Sandra Park's protocols visible in every detail of how her nurses moved and documented and communicated. A family in the waiting area, a man in his 50s and 2 adult children, sitting with the particular stillness of people who are waiting for news and have decided to trust the institution around them. I sat near them for a while, not close enough to intrude, just present. The news, when it came, was good. The surgeon who delivered it was Marcus. He came through the doors in his scrubs with his mask around his neck, and he sat down with the family and told them in plain, careful language what had happened and what came next, and the man in his 50s covered his face with his hands for a moment, not grief, relief, the kind that comes out the same way, and Marcus sat with him and did not rush the moment. I watched from across the room. Then I stood up, gathered my coat, and walked back through the wing toward the exit, past the operating theaters, past the nursing station, past the wall near the main entrance where, mounted in brushed steel on pale gray stone, a plaque read, Turner Foundation Surgical Center, established through the generosity of the Turner Foundation. In service of this community and all who require its care. I had never stood in front of it before. I had seen photographs during the construction, reviewed the design specifications, approved the typeface, but I had never stood in the building as myself, with my name on the wall, and simply looked at it. I stood there for a while. The name looked exactly like it should, not large, not ornate, just clear, and permanent, and true. I thought about a one-bedroom apartment in Norwalk with a radiator that clanged at 2 in the morning. A glass of water. A Tuesday afternoon decision made alone, without witnesses, without applause, without anyone to tell. I thought about a 9-year-old girl in a school parking lot, counting cars until there were none. I thought about 7:14 p.m. on a Wednesday in March, and a door still swinging, and a nurse who brought me tea without being asked. I thought about what it means to build something, not to prove it can be done, not to show anyone who doubted you, but because the building itself is the answer to a question that no one thought to ask on your behalf. You are worth something. You have always been worth something. The plaque did not say that. It didn't need to. Everything in that wing said it, every day, in the language of people being cared for by a place that existed because I decided it should. I put on my coat. I walked out into the August morning. And for the first time, in a very long time, I did not look back. There's something I want to say to you before we go. Not about trust funds or foundation pledges or the machinery of consequence that catches up with people who mistake your silence for weakness. You already know how that part works. You watched it happen. What I want to say is this. The years I spent building in silence were not wasted years. I know it can look that way from the outside. All that time, all that work, and no one knew. But here is what I learned. The silence was not the cost of the work. The silence was the condition that made the work possible. When no one is watching, you build for the right reasons. When no one knows, the only question is whether the thing you are building is actually worth building. I built it because it was worth building. Not for my mother, not for Bryce, not for a ballroom full of people rising to their feet. For the man whose wife took my hand and said he is well. For Marcus, sitting with a family in his scrubs, not rushing the moment. For every person who walks into that wing on the worst day of their life and finds that someone, somewhere, decided they deserved a good building to be cared in. If you have been carrying something that no one can see, keep carrying it. Build it right. Build it clean. Build it so that when the day comes, and it will come, there is nothing to explain and nothing to apologize for and nothing to defend. The work speaks. It always does. If this story found something in you, if you have ever been the person in the room that no one looked at, the person's called a cab, the person whose name no one connected to the thing you built, leave a comment below. I read everyone, and if you are new here, subscribe. We tell the kinds of stories that don't usually get told, the quiet ones, the true ones.